On a brisk Tuesday morning at the University of Michigan, the lecture hall buzzed with the quiet sounds of shuffling, notebooks, and the soft clatter of laptop keys. Students trickled in, settling into their seats with that familiar blend of fatigue and nerves that came with advanced calculus, especially under the command of Professor Linda Cartwright. She was already at the front of the room before most had fully taken their coats off. Tall, sharp-featured, and unsmiling, she carried herself like someone who'd long since earned control over any room she walked into. Her silver-rimmed glasses flashed under the overhead lights, and her gaze, calm, cold, and unflinching, swept over the class like a winter wind. One by one, students straightened up as if caught in the act of slouching. Professor Cartwright didn't believe in easing students into material or giving room for error. She believed in pressure. She believed in silence. She believed in showing you how much you didn't know. Her chalk snapped once against the board, crisp and final. Last time, she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, we covered multivariable limits. Today, we move on to Laplace transforms. Her handwriting was clean, practiced, almost too perfect as she filled the board with dense equations. Students leaned forward, scribbling furiously. A few already looked overwhelmed. Cartwright thrived in that. To her, the struggle was the filter that separated the ordinary from the gifted. Toward the middle of the room sat a tall, soft-spoken young man in a navy hoodie. Josh Reed didn't stand out. He never raised his hand, rarely spoke at all. But behind those quiet eyes, his mind moved like clockwork. Numbers weren't just numbers to him. They were music fluid, patterned, and strangely comforting. He tapped his pen gently against the margin of his notebook, watching the board. Something in the second line of the equation caught his eye, a small error barely noticeable. He hesitated. Maybe he should let it go. But then another student raised her hand. Professor Cartwright, I think there might be a mistake in that second line. The room seemed to freeze. Cartwright turned slowly, eyebrows arched. A mistake, she repeated the word heavy with disbelief. She scanned the board, lips tightening into a smile. No, she said plainly, there isn't. The girl blushed and lowered her hand. Josh sighed, quietly. He hated that. The way some teachers shut students down. Like their authority meant they couldn't be wrong. His hand lifted before he even knew what he was doing. Actually, he said softly, there is. And just like that, the whole room turned to look at him. Something had shifted, and it wouldn't be turning back. For a moment, the room held its breath. Josh Reed stood slowly, not to draw attention, but because he didn't like the feeling of speaking from his chair. He wasn't trying to show anyone up. He just believed in being clear, in standing behind his words. It's in the second step, he said, gently pointing toward the board. You applied the transform to the wrong term. The coefficient doesn't carry over that way. If you work it through like that, the final answer won't match the expected result. The chalk in Professor Cartwright's hand didn't move. Her jaw shifted ever so slightly as she turned to the equation again. Then there it was, the mistake. Subtle but real. Her grip on the chalk tightened. The room stayed silent, waiting. Some students had stopped taking notes altogether, their eyes flicking between Josh and the professor, sensing something electric in the air. Cartwright's lips curved into a tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. Well, Mr. Reed, she said with forced calm, since you seem so sure, why don't you show us the correct way? There was an edge to her voice, not quite hostile, but pointed. It wasn't an invitation, it was a challenge. A few students exchanged glances. Josh could feel the tension building around him, the unspoken dare. Let's see if you really know what you're talking about. He walked quietly to the front of the lecture hall. The chalk felt dry and powdery in his hand. He didn't fumble. He didn't flinch. He just focused on the numbers. Erasing the mistaken portion, he rewrote the equation with firm, deliberate strokes. His handwriting was a little uneven compared to hers, more functional than beautiful, but the math was clean. True. And as he worked, he spoke in the same calm, steady tone. The transform needs to be applied after maintaining the coefficient inside the function. Pulling it out early shifts the limits of the integral. Cartwright didn't interrupt. She stood motionless, arms crossed her face, unreadable. Josh set the chalk down, stepped back, and returned to his seat. The class stayed quiet. Cartwright stared at the board for a moment longer, then slowly turned back toward the students. "Fine," she said curtly. "You corrected it. Congratulations." No nod, no thanks, just the facts. Josh didn't mind. He hadn't done it for praise. He just couldn't leave a mistake sitting there, not when he knew better. Some students looked impressed. Others looked annoyed, as if he had broken some unspoken code. "Sit down, stay quiet, don't make the professor look bad." But Josh wasn't trying to make anyone look bad. He just couldn't let something incorrect go by unchallenged. Cartwright turned sharply, wiping away the board with fast, tight movements. "Let's move on," she said briskly. "Since Mr. Reed is so eager to contribute, I assume he won't mind another challenge." Josh blinked. "Excuse me?" She was already scribbling a new equation, longer and far more intricate. It sprawled across the board like a living thing, nested integrals, chained, limits, differential components twisted together in ways that weren't standard for their level of study. When she finished, she stepped aside, marker in hand, like a judge presenting the terms of a duel. "Go ahead," she said coolly. "Solve this." There was a pause, then a few chuckles, a chair squeaking as someone shifted, waiting for the spectacle to begin. Some students leaned in, as if watching the opening move of a chess match. Josh looked at the equation, and he knew instantly what this was. It wasn't a test of knowledge. It was a trap. She wanted him to hesitate, to get it partly right and then fumble, proving that what happened earlier was a fluke. She wanted to show the class that she was still the smartest one in the room. He stood again slowly. "Take your time," Cartwright added, with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. But Josh didn't need time. The second he picked up the chalk, the room began to fade. It was just him and the math. His mind moved quickly, the numbers snapping into place in his head like magnets finding their match. He didn't even have to pause between steps. He could already see the entire pathway from start to finish, every transformation, every simplification, the final answer already forming before his hand had reached the middle of the board. The scratching of chalk was the only sound. Midway through, he glanced over his shoulder. "Do you want the answer in exponentials?" he asked, "or would you prefer trigonometric functions?" Cartwright didn't respond. He continued his handwriting, brisk but accurate. He boxed the final result, turned, and placed the chalk quietly on the tray. Again, silence. Then a soft whistle from the back of the room. Cartwright's face didn't change, but her body was taut. She stepped forward, scanning the board, carefully, line by line, looking for the flaw. The one thing she could point to and say, "Ah, there. That's where you went wrong." But there was nothing. The problem was solved. Cleanly, elegantly, perfectly. Josh stood, arms folded loosely, not smiling, not smug, just waiting. "Lucky guess," Cartwright muttered. A few students stifled laughs, not at Josh, at her. He tilted his head slightly. It wasn't a guess. Her nostrils flared. "Sit down, Mr. Reed." He did, but the room felt different now. Something had shifted in the space between the desks and the chalkboard, and the quiet glances passed from one student to the next. Professor Cartwright turned back to the board, but her hand still holding the chalk trembled just a little. This wasn't over, and everyone knew it. For the rest of that morning, the energy in Professor Cartwright's lecture hall was different, subtle but unmistakable. Students who once scribbled notes nervously were now glancing toward the middle of the room, toward Josh Reed, as if seeing him for the first time. Some with admiration, a few with something closer to resentment. Cartwright, for her part, pressed on with her lecture, but the crisp confidence in her voice had dulled. Her chalk no longer moved with the same smooth assurance. There was tension in the way she wrote, in the way she held herself. Josh hadn't set out to challenge her. He didn't enjoy the spotlight, but he also didn't shrink from it, not when the truth was on the board for everyone to see. Then midway through a sentence about inverse Laplace transforms, Cartwright stopped. The words seemed to catch in her throat. Her eyes scanned the rows of students until they landed back on him. "If you're feeling so confident today, Mr. Reed," she said, her voice laced with forced politeness, "perhaps we should raise the stakes a bit." A few murmurs rippled through the class. Some students shifted in their chairs alert. Others leaned forward, sensing that the morning's tension was about to break open into something more. Josh kept his gaze steady. "What do you mean?" Cartwright walked over to her desk and pulled out a thick textbook one the students hadn't seen her use before. The sound of the pages flipping echoed softly as she searched for something deep within the book. She paused on a section, then turned it around for the class to see. The equations were dense, the kind you didn't see until graduate school, if ever. "This," she said, tapping the page, "comes from a graduate-level course. It's not something I expect an undergraduate to be able to solve." A quiet wave of reaction swept through the hall. Raised eyebrows, widened eyes. But she continued, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Since you seem to have such a natural gift for this material, why don't you prove it?" Her smile didn't reach her eyes. The room fell still. Josh stared at the problem. He recognized it immediately. He'd come across it once before, buried in a supplemental textbook. He had read on his own, more out of curiosity than anything else. And now here it was being presented as a test. But this wasn't about the math anymore. He understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't about finding the right answer. This was about control. Cartwright wanted him to stumble in front of the entire class, to show that while he might be clever, he didn't belong in the deep end, that he'd flown too close to the sun. He could have said no. He didn't owe her this performance. But then again, the way the class was looking at him, the way some of them were waiting to see if he'd back down, made the decision for him. He stood. Cartwright's smile wavered just a hair. He stepped forward, and she handed him the textbook. He didn't even glance at it again. He had memorized the problem already. Taking the chalk in hand, he faced the board. The numbers were hard, yes, but that didn't scare him. Not anymore. Josh began to write. His movements were calm, measured, deliberate. He didn't rush. There was no need. Each symbol flowed naturally from the one before it. Each transformation led gracefully to the next. He let the problem unfold the way he saw it in his mind, not as a wall to scale, but as a path to walk. Complicated, yes, but not impossible. The class was silent now. Even the faint rustle of notebooks had stopped. When he reached the final expression, he boxed the answer, carefully underlining it once. Then he set the chalk down and turned to face the room. Cartwright didn't speak. Her jaw tightened slightly as she approached the board, scanning the work line by line, her eyes hunting for any misstep, any small miscalculation she could seize. But the board offered her nothing. He hadn't just solved it. He had done it elegantly, efficiently, with a kind of clarity that was hard to fake. From the back of the room, someone let out a soft, disbelieving laugh. "Yo, what?" A few students started whispering. Heads leaned together. They weren't talking about Cartwright anymore. Josh stood with his arms folded loosely, not in triumph, but in quiet readiness. He wasn't gloating. He just didn't feel the need to apologize for being right. Cartwright's hand twitched at her son's. Then, as if struggling to find her footing again, she said sharply, "You skipped a step." Josh raised a brow. "No, I didn't." "Yes, you did," she said, her voice tight. He turned back to the board, scanning it quickly. Then, without missing a beat, he pointed near the center of the work. "You mean here?" he asked. "The simplification during partial fraction, decomposition. I worked that part out in my head. The algebra is basic enough to skip writing it line by line." Cartwright said nothing. "If you'd like," he offered with no edge in his voice, "I can write it out." It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't sarcastic. It was simply honest. And that more than anything made it worse. She inhaled sharply. "No, that won't be necessary." Cartwright turned away, setting the textbook on her desk with a thud that was just a little too loud. She faced the class again, her composure returning in pieces. Josh walked quietly back to his seat. As he sat down, he could feel it. The weight of the shift, the respect, the tension, the disbelief, the change in how everyone, especially Cartwright, now saw him. He hadn't tried to take anything from her, but the truth had a way of making its own space, and it had spoken clear as chalk. Josh had barely returned to his seat when the silence in the room began to fracture. A few hushed whispers swirled like wind around the edge of the hall, students leaning toward one another with raised eyebrows and quiet astonishment. No one looked at Professor Cartwright the same way anymore. Something about her sharp authority had dulled like a blade that had finally met resistance. Cartwright tried to carry him as returning to the board, as if nothing had happened, but the crispness in her voice never fully returned. She moved through the rest of the lecture on autopilot, her chalk lines straighter than ever, her words slightly clipped. Still, she wasn't done. Anyone watching closely could tell that much. Her pride wasn't built to absorb public defeat, and certainly not from a student. Then, without warning, she stopped mid-sentence. The pause was longer than it needed to be. She turned and scanned the room slowly, her eyes settling once again on Josh. "If you're so confident, Mr. Reed," she said with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes, "perhaps we can give you a more suitable challenge." Her tone was lighter than before, almost playful, but underneath it, the tension crackled like static. Josh didn't answer right away. He just looked back at her, calm, waiting. Cartwright walked over to her desk and pulled a folder from beneath a stack of papers. She opened it with slow, deliberate fingers flipping through until she found what she wanted. "There's a university-sponsored mathematics symposium next month," she began. "Students from all over the region will be competing, graduate and undergraduate alike. It's rigorous, time-pressured, public, not just about solving problems, but about doing it under the weight of an audience." She looked up, locking eyes with him. "I assume you'd be up for it," the class murmured again. A few students glanced at Josh with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. Others leaned forward, sensing this wasn't just an invitation, it was something else. Josh understood it immediately. She was setting the stage not for recognition, but for risk. He saw it for what it was, not an opportunity, but a trap. If he said no, it would confirm her quiet suspicions that he wasn't ready, that today had been a lucky strike. And if he said yes, he'd be walking into a high-pressure storm of expectations, competing against students who had trained for years, with reputations to defend and professors to impress. Either way, she'd have something to work with. Josh took a breath, slow and steady. "I'm in," he said simply. For the first time, Cartwright's expression shifted, not much, but enough. A small flicker in her jaw, like she hadn't expected him to call her bluff. "Excellent," she replied and closed the folder with a quiet snap. The rest of the lecture continued, but no one was really listening anymore. By the time class let out, the news had already begun to ripple across campus. Students passed the word in the halls, trading versions of what had happened that morning, like gossip in a small town. Josh Reed had gone toe-to-toe with Professor Cartwright, and now he was headed for a showdown at a regional math symposium. Some students nodded at him in the halls, a new kind of respect in their eyes. Others just stared, curious, cautious. It felt strange being noticed after so long, blending into the background. But Josh didn't linger in the attention. He had work to do. That evening, the library lights burned long past sunset. Josh sat at a corner table surrounded by open textbooks, pages of scribbled equations, and a half-drunk cup of coffee gone cold hours ago. The quiet hum of the building was his comfort. Numbers were his language, and tonight he was speaking fluently. He had always loved math. But now it wasn't just about the joy of solving problems, it was about proving something deeper. Something Cartwright had tried to chip away at. He wasn't doing this for her. He was doing it because she expected him to fail. A soft voice broke his focus. Burning the midnight oil already, Josh looked up. It was Brian, one of the top students in the class and one of Cartwright's quiet favorites. He wasn't unkind, just cautious like someone who knew how to navigate power without challenging it. Josh shrugged. Gotta be ready. Brian pulled out a chair and sat across from him, nodding thoughtfully. You know, he said you're already ahead of half the folks who compete in those symposiums. Cartwright only tossed your name in because you embarrassed her today. Josh leaned back, arm crossed. I know. Brian studied him for a moment. So why do it? Josh paused. He had asked himself the same question. He didn't need to go. He could have let it pass, stayed out of the spotlight, and returned to the quiet he was used to. But that wasn't the whole story. If I back down now, he said slowly, she'll take that as proof that I'm clever but not serious, talented but not disciplined. She'll make that the story. And I'm not going to give her that. Brian cracked a smile. Now that I can respect. Josh gave a quiet smile in return. 4 weeks. That was all the time he had. 4 weeks to prepare for a competition where others had spent entire semesters or years training. But he didn't flinch. He just opened the next textbook, took a breath, and got back to work. Because sometimes proving someone wrong isn't about anger. It's about holding your ground long enough for the truth to rise. 4 weeks passed like a breath held too long. The day of the symposium arrived with gray skies hanging low over the University of Pennsylvania. Inside the large auditorium, rows of tiered seats wrapped around a central stage. It didn't feel like a classroom, it felt like an arena. A soft hum of conversation filled the room, but the air was tight with expectation. Josh stood near the front, watching the other competitors settle into their assigned seats. Most were older, many were graduate students. Some wore blazers, others button-down shirts and serious faces. He wore what he always wore, a hoodie and jeans, sleeves pushed up just enough to keep chalk or ink off his hands. He felt eyes on him, not just from students, but from professors seated among the audience. Observers, judges, critics, including one familiar face, Professor Cartwright, seated near the back, hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. She hadn't said much to him since the day she entered him into this competition. No encouragement, no advice, just a nod the morning they left, as if she were merely chaperoning a student she barely knew. Josh didn't need her words. He already understood her expectations. She was waiting for him to falter. At the sound of a chime, the first round began. A proctor announced it was mental math, no writing, no calculators, just numbers. Pure, raw calculation. Josh's hands moved smoothly over the response pad in front of him, faster than the evaluators could confirm answers. While some competitors paused, brows furrowed in concentration, he didn't hesitate. The numbers came to him like notes in a melody ordered intuitive. Next came theoretical applications, proofs, and problem breakdowns. Here, Josh felt something settle inside him, not calm exactly, but purpose. Concepts others wrestled with for hours unfolded in his mind like puzzle pieces clicking into place. He wasn't guessing. He was seeing the structure, the logic, the silent harmony behind the chaos. Then came speed solving. This was where most students cracked. Timers ticked loudly, pressure distorted even the most prepared minds. But Josh leaned into it. While others scribbled and backtracked, he moved cleanly, efficiently. His name crept higher on the scoreboard with each round. And then the final challenge arrived. Only 2 competitors remained in serious contention. Josh and a PhD candidate from MIT. A man nearly 10 years his senior with a quiet confidence of his own. The problem flashed on the screen above the stage. Gasps escaped across the auditorium. Layer upon layer of integrals, summations, recursive patterns buried inside nested functions. It wasn't just long, it was exhausting, meant to test mental endurance as much as intelligence. Josh let out a slow breath. He picked up his pen. His pulse steadied, his thoughts quieted. He didn't try to rush. That was the trap. Instead, he worked with the same rhythm he taught himself during those long nights in the library, line by line, step by step. He could hear the soft scratching of pens around him, the MIT student working furiously, but Josh stayed focused. He saw the heart of the problem, the pattern no one else might notice. A shortcut, a shift, a cleaner path. His hand moved faster now, not from panic but clarity. One more simplification. Then another. The final answer took shape. He boxed it carefully, set his pen down. The timer buzzed. Josh exhaled and leaned back in his chair, eyes rising to meet the clock above. His competitor was still writing, chasing a solution that had already been caught. Silence took the room. One of the judges stood walking slowly across the stage to inspect both sets of work. The moments that followed stretched on like drawn breath, still heavy waiting. Then the judge spoke into the microphone. The winner of the 2025 University Mathematics Symposium is Josh Reed. The auditorium broke open in applause. Some students clapped, some gasped out loud. A few just stared, mouths slightly open, as if they hadn't fully believed until that moment. Josh sat still, letting the sound wash over him like rain on stone. He hadn't won just a competition. He had won back the truth. The right to define himself, not by stereotypes, not by someone else's doubts, but by what he knew and who he was. His eyes swept the crowd and found Cartwright. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't frowning either. She looked unsure, like she was seeing something she hadn't been prepared for. And maybe for the first time, she was starting to question the framework through which she had seen him all along. She gave a slow nod, small, barely there. Josh didn't need more than that. He had let the numbers speak, and they had said everything that needed to be said. The morning after the symposium, the skies over Ann Arbor had turned a pale, forgiving blue. The campus felt quieter than usual, as if the air itself had taken a breath. Josh Reed walked into the same lecture hall where it had all begun. Same familiar seats, same scent of chalk dust and overworn carpet. He slipped into his usual spot, second row from the back, right under the air vent that always buzzed faintly when the heat kicked in. He didn't look different, and he wasn't trying to. That was never the point. A few students glanced over their shoulders at him. One or two gave small nods of recognition, the kind people give a neighbor they've seen in the paper. Brian caught his eye and grinned knowingly, then turned forward as the door at the front opened. Professor Cartwright walked in just as precise and composed as always. Her heels clicked against the floor in perfect rhythm. She reached her desk, adjusted a few papers, and faced the room. Her expression was calm, professional, but there was something different in her posture, an extra moment of stillness, a pause that held weight. Before we begin today's lecture, she said, her voice steady, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the results of yesterday's mathematics symposium. The room stilled. Josh Reed, she continued, glancing toward him, took first place in a competition that included some of the best mathematical minds from across the country. Graduate students, doctoral candidates, people who've spent years preparing for this kind of challenge. Her tone didn't rise. She didn't draw it out. No applause cue, no over-the-top celebration, just the truth. That, she said, is no small achievement. A beat of silence passed before a few students clapped, hesitant at first, then stronger. Brian gave him a quiet thumbs up under the desk. A couple of students turned to look at Josh, their expressions somewhere between surprise and something deeper, respect. Cartwright turned back to the board and picked up a piece of chalk. And with that said, she continued, let's begin. That was it. No dramatic speeches, no apologies, no long reflections, just an acknowledgement, and somehow that meant more than anything else she could have said. Josh sat back in his seat. He didn't need more. He hadn't entered that competition for praise. He hadn't stood at the board to prove her wrong. Not really. He had done it because he refused to let someone else write the story of who he was. For weeks, Cartwright had tested him, pushed him, challenged him with the weight of her position and the expectations that clung to it. But at every turn, Josh had answered not with anger, not with attitude, but with clarity, with numbers, with truth. And now something in the room had changed, not just for him, but for everyone watching. Because when a student like Josh, quiet, overlooked, counted out rises without needing to shout, without needing revenge, just with steady truth, it leaves a mark. Cartwright continued her lecture, her voice measured and sure. But she didn't avoid his eyes anymore. When she asked a question, she didn't skip past him. And when he answered, she listened fully. In that small shift, something unspoken was finally understood. Respect, the kind that couldn't be forced or faked, had found its way into the space between them. Josh picked up his pen. He wasn't done learning, but from now on he'd do it as someone who had already proven he belonged. By the time spring settled softly over the University of Michigan, the buzz around Josh Reed had faded into something quieter, no longer a burst of chatter, but a deep undercurrent of respect. He still sat in the same seat, still wore that old hoodie, still took notes in a battered spiral notebook. But when students walked into class, they looked at him differently. Not as the quiet kid who kept to himself, but as the one who stood tall when it mattered. Professor Cartwright never spoke of the symposium again after that morning. She didn't need to. Something had changed between them, something no one else needed to see or name. She no longer questioned him sharply in front of the class. When she asked him a question, it wasn't to challenge him, but to hear what he had to say. And Josh, he never gloated, never made a scene. He simply continued forward, steady as ever. Because for him, it was never about being the best. It was about being seen. And now finally he was. This story isn't just about math or classrooms. It's about quiet strength, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but earns it through grace and truth. Josh didn't argue. He didn't fight back with anger. He simply let his work speak over and over until the world had no choice but to listen. There are times in life when we're misunderstood, underestimated, even challenged in ways that feel unfair. But sometimes the best response isn't to shout, but to stand tall in who you are, to walk your path with quiet dignity. And when the moment comes to let the truth, your truth, do the speaking. Because real change doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it comes through clarity. If this story touched something in you, maybe reminded you of someone or a moment in your own life, I'd love to hear it. Share your thoughts below if you feel moved to, or just sit with the story a little while longer. That's just as good. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, real human stories that speak to the heart, you're warmly invited to stay with us. No pressure, just a gentle welcome to come back anytime. Take care of yourself, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.